The sky over Enugu was unusually clear on the day Ifeoma gave birth to twin boys, Samto and Kamsi. The nurses in the local hospital cheered as Chinedu carried the tiny boys in each arm, tears streaming down his face as he whispered prayers of gratitude. They were his miracle. After years of financial struggle and 2 miscarriages, these twins were proof that God hadn't forgotten him. Ifeoma, tired but radiant, smiled from her hospital bed as family members poured in with hot flasks of jollof rice and prayers. For the first time in a long while, joy filled their modest home in Accra layout. Chinedu was a secondary school teacher earning just enough to survive, but he believed love, patience, and prayer could build a fortress stronger than gold. The first few months of parenthood were hard but beautiful. Chinedu and Ifeoma took turns feeding the boys at night, rocking them when they cried, laughing when their little hands grasped at empty air. Ifeoma especially glowed, singing lullabies to the twins, bragging to the women at church about how strong Samto's grip was and how Kamsi always stared intensely like a philosopher. But as the twins turned 1, then 2, milestones that were supposed to come naturally, speaking, walking, responding to their names, were absent. Ifeoma's excitement began to dwindle, and in its place, unease crept in. Maybe they're just late bloomers, Chinedu said, still smiling, but he too began to watch more closely. Their silence wasn't just silence, it was a kind of void. No eye contact, no pointing, no gestures, just constant spinning of objects and repetitive humming. By the time they were 3, the truth became unavoidable. The doctor's words rang like gunshots in the small consultation room. "Your sons are both on the autism spectrum," he said gently, explaining it wasn't a curse, just a neurodevelopmental difference. Chinedu nodded, trying to absorb every word, asking for pamphlets and therapy referrals. But Ifeoma sat frozen, her face expressionless, eyes dark. On the way home, she stared out the window in silence while the twins rocked back and forth in their car seats. That night, she cried for hours. "Why me?" she whispered. "What kind of God punishes a woman like this?" Chinedu held her, tried to pray, but her pain was louder than his faith. The perfect beginning was cracking, and neither of them knew if their love could survive the weight of what was to come. In their neighborhood, word spread fast. One of the church women who'd visited the hospital 3 years ago now whispered to others that Ifeoma's twins weren't talking. The gossip multiplied like wildfire. Neighbors began to stare differently. Invitations to birthday parties stopped coming. Women who used to stop and admire the twins now crossed the road or muttered, "God forbid bad thing." Ifeoma, once the pride of her mother's compound for being the first to marry a graduate, now became the subject of ridicule. Her mother, Mama Onyenai, visited and declared with certainty, "Those children are not normal. You must have offended someone in the village. Or perhaps it's from Chinedu's side. Madness runs in that family." Ifeoma's lips trembled with rage and confusion. Chinedu, hearing the comments, tried to remain calm, but every insult felt like a dagger to his chest. Each day, Chinedu took the boys for walks, teaching them colors and shapes out loud even when they barely responded. But Ifeoma started withdrawing. She stopped combing her hair. She avoided the market. She flinched when the twins made loud sounds or flapped their hands. She no longer kissed them good night. The final straw came when one of the boys had a meltdown in church, screaming and rocking violently. Ushers looked on with pity and annoyance. A few murmured that the children were possessed. Later that night, Ifeoma broke down. "I can't live like this, Chinedu. I can't. They don't talk. They don't look at me. They don't even know I'm their mother," she cried. Chinedu held her shoulders and pleaded, "They're still our children. They feel. They understand. Just not the way others do." But Ifeoma wasn't listening. Her heart had begun to harden. Where Chinedu saw challenge, she saw a trap. She began blaming him for everything, the poverty, the twins, even the doctor's diagnosis. "If I'd married someone else, maybe I'd have normal children," she screamed one afternoon during a heated argument. Chinedu stood stunned, his jaw trembling, the twins in the background humming to themselves, oblivious to the chaos. The love they once had was buried under layers of shame, bitterness, and cultural stigma. And slowly, Ifeoma's affection for her own children began to rot into something darker. Rejection. She stopped talking to them altogether. Stopped touching them. They became shadows in her home. To Chinedu, this was the most painful betrayal of all. Weeks turned into months, and the tension in the house became suffocating. Ifeoma no longer cooked. She rarely left her room. The twins wandered aimlessly, sometimes crying without reason, sometimes laughing hysterically at walls. Chinedu tried to hold the house together, bathing the boys, cooking yam porridge, and still rushing to teach his classes. He returned home each night to silence, or, worse, more fighting. Ifeoma accused him of dragging her down, of being too soft, too naive. You think love will fix everything? Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't cure madness, she shouted one night. Chinedu, exhausted, said nothing. He was beginning to realize that Ifeoma was slipping further and further away, not just from him, but from reality. Then came the physical distance. Ifeoma began sleeping in the boys' former nursery, turned into a storage room. Chinedu would hear her whispering on the phone late at night, giggling, a sound he hadn't heard from her in years. When he asked who she was speaking to, she snapped, "None of your business." Soon, strange text messages began flashing on her phone. She started dressing up again, wearing perfume, and going out without explanation. Chinedu followed her once, and saw her enter a flashy car, driven by a man in designer shades. His heart sank. He didn't confront her. What was the point? The woman he once called wife was gone. All that remained was her body, her bitterness, and her scorn. The final blow came 2 weeks later. It was a Friday evening. Rain lashed against the windows. Chinedu came back from work soaked and tired, only to find the house eerily quiet. The twins were asleep in their room, but Ifeoma's things were gone. Her clothes, her handbag, her shoes. On the center table was a note, hastily written and smeared with water stains. "I'm done. I can't carry this burden anymore. Don't look for me." Chinedu stared at the paper, hands trembling. He looked into the room where the boys lay, one curled up tightly, the other humming to himself. And then he fell to his knees and wept, loud, broken sobs that shook the walls. In that moment, he wasn't just crying for his marriage. He was crying for his sons, for their innocence, for the rejection they would never fully understand. And somewhere deep in his soul, something hardened. He swore never to let them feel abandoned again. No matter how hard the road ahead, he would carry them, alone, if he had to. The rain did not stop that night. It came down like heaven was weeping alongside Chinedu. Thunder rolled over the rusted rooftops of Accra Layout, but inside the house it was quiet, painfully so. The twins slept soundly, unaware that their mother had vanished. Chinedu sat on the cold floor for hours, staring at the crumpled note in his hand. He read it over and over again, hoping it would change. But it didn't. It said the same thing. She was gone. And in that instant, the burden of fatherhood tripled. He wasn't just raising autistic children. He was now their everything. Their mother, their father, their protector, their teacher. No one was coming to save him. The weight of this truth nearly broke his spine, but something stubborn within him refused to surrender. By morning, Chinedu cleaned his face, prepared yam porridge, and dressed the twins in matching Ankara shirts. He took them to school despite the stares, despite the questions whispered behind hands. When the teacher asked where their mother was, he simply replied, "Traveled." But his eyes were glassy and red. He returned home, folded Ifeoma's remaining clothes, and locked them in a trunk. Not out of spite, but to remove the ghost that now haunted every room. He washed dishes with trembling hands, swept the compound with his mind blank, then collapsed on the couch with his sons curled beside him. They stared at the ceiling together, each lost in their world. And in that silence, something shifted. Chinedu no longer waited for Ifeoma to return. He began to make peace with the possibility that she never would. Weeks passed, then months. Rumors spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. Some said she had gone to Lagos with a wealthy man. Others claimed she'd been seen in Enugu living large with a businessman. Church women came by occasionally with veiled sympathy. "Take heart, my brother," they said, offering loaves of bread and fake prayers. One of them even had the audacity to suggest he drop the twins at a home for special children and move on with his life. Chinedu didn't respond. He didn't need their pity. What he needed was strength, and that he was determined to build. He began studying autism at night using his old laptop. He read everything: early interventions, therapy routines, nonverbal communication cues. If he was going to raise these boys alone, he would arm himself with knowledge and faith, not just for survival, but for their future. Every morning became a battle, not with his children, but with the world around him. From the landlord who complained about the boys' loud noises at night to the market women who muttered Ogbanj under their breath as he carried Samto on his back, Chinedu endured it all. He had taken on multiple jobs: driving Kiki in the morning, teaching lessons in the afternoon, mopping floors at a local office in the evening, all to make sure his sons had what they needed. There were days he didn't eat, so they could. Days his shoes had holes. Nights he broke down alone in the toilet, muffling his sobs into his palm so the boys wouldn't hear. His life became a rhythm of resilience: wake, work, teach, bathe, clean, cry, repeat. Despite the pain, he found moments of light. Samto began responding to his name. Kamsi stopped banging his head against the wall after Chinedu started using weighted blankets, an idea he learned from an autism blog. They didn't say daddy, but they touched his face gently when he was sad. That was enough for him. He celebrated every small win like it was a graduation: when Kamsi used a spoon for the first time, when Samto clapped in rhythm to a church song, when they both held hands during an evening walk. He documented their progress with pictures, videos, and handwritten notes in a small blue diary titled, "For My Sons, When You Can Read One Day." That diary became his therapy. He wrote his fears, his joys, his heartbreaks, and his hopes into it like prayer. Still, there were nights that nearly shattered him. One night, Samto had a severe meltdown. He screamed for 3 hours straight, thrashing, biting, crying without stopping. Chinedu tried everything: soothing words, back rubs, his favorite toy. Nothing worked. At some point, exhausted, Chinedu sat on the floor, arms stretched, and began crying alongside his son. Tears poured uncontrollably from his eyes. "Why you, my son? Why not me?" he whispered. Kamsi crawled silently to his father and placed a half-eaten banana in his lap, a gift of comfort from one twin to another broken soul. In that moment, Chinedu realized that while they were different, his boys understood love. And that love, even if unspoken, would be enough to keep them going. It had to be. By the end of the year, Chinedu had developed a routine so rigid, it felt like a survival mechanism. Wake up at 4 a.m., prepare rice and beans. Dress the boys. Drop them off at the special needs center Ada had referred him to. Go drive Kiki for 6 hours. Rush back, pick them up, attend their therapy sessions twice a week, cook, clean, collapse. Repeat. His body began to betray him. Backaches, eye twitches, headaches that wouldn't go away. But he dared not stop. There was no backup parent, no rich uncle. It was him or nobody. His friends from university had moved on, some in banks, some abroad, but he avoided their calls. He didn't want pity, and he didn't want to explain why he looked 10 years older than his age. One afternoon, after dropping Samto and Kamsi at their therapy class, Chinedu sat under a mango tree at the school compound and broke down. A young woman in a yellow blouse, with thick glasses and kind eyes, noticed him. She approached and asked softly, "Are you okay?" That was how Adora entered his life. A social worker assigned to the center, Adora had seen countless parents come and go, many broken like him. But something about Chinedu struck her: his quiet strength, his refusal to let go despite drowning. She began checking on him often, offering advice, worksheets, audio lessons, and more. She encouraged him to apply for small grants. She introduced him to a support group. For the first time, someone saw his struggle and didn't offer pity, just help. At first, he resisted. He was used to carrying everything alone. But Adora had a way of slipping through the cracks in his armor. She connected with the boys easily. She knew how to redirect their stimming, how to get Kamsi to focus, how to make Samto smile. The twins began to look forward to seeing Auntie Ada. And soon, so did Chinidu. They never discussed Ifioma, though Adora had clearly heard the gossip. She didn't judge. She simply stood beside him and helped. In a world that had turned its back, this woman had extended a hand. And though Chinidu didn't know it yet, that simple act would become the seed of something far greater. Hope. School was never meant to be a battlefield, but for Samto and Kamsi, it was one they walked into daily, sometimes in silence, other times in tears. Though they had been enrolled at a special learning center thanks to Adaora's recommendation, Chinidu had to supplement their education with a small mainstream community school nearby, primarily because the therapy center didn't offer full-time academic programs. From the very first day, the boys were labeled. The other children called them names: Mumu twins, zombie boys, the mad ones. Some of the teachers tried to help, but they weren't trained in handling children on the spectrum. When Samto flapped his arms in excitement or Kamsi recited the alphabet over and over again to soothe himself, they were punished instead of redirected. One teacher, frustrated one day, told Chinidu to take his mad children to a shrine, not a school. Chinidu stood there, silent but burning. He didn't raise his hand or voice. He simply withdrew his boys and walked away. Another door closed, another wound added. At home, things weren't any easier. The twins had opposite sensory triggers. Samto hated loud sounds, while Kamsi became aggressive in complete silence. If one wanted music, the other wanted quiet. If one needed touch, the other resisted it. Chinidu became a full-time student of his own children, learning which foods triggered meltdowns, which fabrics made them cry, which street noises caused Samto to scream, and which lighting kept Kamsi calm. Bath time became a war zone. Mealtime required endless patience. Kamsi would only eat jollof rice with fish, and it had to be in the blue plate, never the red one. Samto could only drink water if it was poured in front of him. Any change to this sacred routine could result in a meltdown that lasted hours. Chinidu kept a notebook where he recorded all of it, day by day, struggle by struggle. He called it the manual, even though it often felt more like a survival diary than a parenting guide. Despite all this, Chinidu refused to let the world define his boys by their differences. He continued researching day and night, sacrificing rest to read international blogs, medical journals, and parenting forums. He saved money to buy second-hand sensory toys and handmade flashcards. Most nights he would lie between the twins as they rocked themselves to sleep, his body aching, but his spirit quietly fighting. He prayed over them constantly. "Lord, let me live long enough to see them stand on their own," he whispered into the silence. Yet, amid this fatigue, a slow transformation was happening. Samto began to communicate using simple gestures, pointing at food, shaking his head at sounds he didn't like. Kamsi responded to visual cues, following instructions when cards were used. They were small steps, but for a father who had once feared they would remain forever locked away in silence, it was a miracle. A miracle he didn't take for granted. Adora began visiting more frequently. Initially, it was to check on the twins' therapy progress, but over time, it became clear she was invested in more than her job. She brought coloring books, puzzles, calming kits, and even special soaps that didn't irritate Samto's skin. The twins began responding more to her than to anyone else apart from Chinidu. They greeted her with excited squeals and tugged on her handbag when she visited. Chinidu watched with growing awe. Adaora's presence was like light in a cave that had been dark for too long. She never judged his boys. She never flinched when Kamsi screamed or Samto ran in circles. Instead, she got down on the floor, played with them, mirrored their actions, and taught Chinidu how to join in. Connection before correction, she would say. And it worked. For the first time, the twins began smiling more, even laughing. It was a sound Chinidu had missed for too long. One evening, after helping the boys settle, Adora stayed behind. They sat on the wooden bench outside Chinidu's compound, under a flickering bulb surrounded by mosquitoes. The silence between them was warm, not awkward. "You're doing better than most two-parent households I know," she finally said, breaking the quiet. Chinedu chuckled bitterly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Most days I feel like I'm failing," he confessed. Adora looked at him, really looked, and said, "Then you don't know how rare you are." That sentence pierced through the walls Chinedu had built around his heart. For years he'd only known judgment, from neighbors, in-laws, even Ifioma. But here was a woman who saw his struggle and still saw strength. Something shifted in him that night. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something sacred. Trust. Over time, Adora became part of their routine. Not in a romantic way, but in the most intimate way possible. Through presence. She helped Chinedu create schedules using picture charts, introduced him to other parents in her network, and encouraged him to apply for a local government grant for special needs families. When Chinedu hesitated, she filled out the forms herself and walked him through the process. When the grant came through, a modest but life-saving 50,000 Nigerian nairas per quarter, he cried in her presence for the first time. He didn't mean to. It just happened. He cried for the burden eased, for the twins, for the years lost, and for this woman who had walked into his storm with calm hands. Adora simply held his hand and said, "You're not alone anymore, Chinedu." And for the first time in years, he believed it. It was the annual children's celebration at the therapy center, a simple community gathering meant to showcase the progress of the children under care. Parents were invited to witness their children perform songs, poems, or dances, whatever their abilities allowed. Chinedu had never attended such a thing before. The idea of sitting in a hall, surrounded by people who would stare at his boys like they were fragile creatures, terrified him. But Adora insisted. "It's not about them," she said. "It's about showing your boys that they're seen and that they matter." Chinedu hesitated, but in the end, he agreed. He dressed Samto and Kamsi in clean, matching white kaftans. The twins were fidgety, but unusually calm that day. Adora met them at the gate and walked them inside. The hall was packed. Chinedu felt his chest tighten, but he sat near the front and held his breath. When the event began, several children came up to perform. Some sang, some recited poems, others simply waved at the crowd. Then the host called for Samto and Kamsi's. Chinedu's heart skipped. He had no idea what was planned. Adora gave him a reassuring smile. The twins walked up slowly, led by a therapist. On stage, a chart was set up. Samto stood beside it, holding a pointer. Kamsi stood beside him, silent. Then, without being prompted, Samto began to tap the chart and count. 1, 2, or up to 20. The hall was silent. Then he began naming animals, pointing at pictures. Cat, dog, elephant, lion. His voice was flat, robotic, but it was his voice. A murmur of awe rippled through the crowd. Chinedu froze. His mouth hung open. His son, his silent, nonverbal son, was speaking. Tears flowed freely down his cheeks. People clapped. Some parents even stood. Kamsi didn't speak, but he hugged Samto from the side in a rare display of affection. Adora leaned into Chinedu and whispered, "This is just the beginning." That night, Chinedu couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor beside his sons and stared at the ceiling, heart bursting. The boy who once screamed at the sound of footsteps now spoke in front of a crowd. The boy who once wouldn't look at his father now smiled when he saw him. The journey was still long. There would still be battles. But in that moment, one thing was clear. Hope had taken root in their story. And from that seed, something beautiful would grow. Following Samto's public breakthrough, something in Chinedu ignited. For years he had been silent, accepting pity, absorbing judgment, and surviving shame with clenched teeth. But that day, standing in front of a hall that gave his son a standing ovation, he realized he had a voice. And more importantly, that voice mattered. With Adora's guidance, he began to speak publicly at local schools and churches about autism awareness. His first speech was shaky. He read from a crumpled paper and stammered several times. But when he finished, the hall clapped, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Word spread. People began referring to him as that man raising autistic twins alone. A small NGO invited him to share his story. Then a radio station in Enugu aired an interview where he spoke in Igbo about the danger of stigmatizing children who were different. For the first time in years, Chinedu was no longer invisible. With support from the community and small donations, Adora helped him register a non-profit organization, Voices of the Quiet Ones Foundation. The mission was simple: support families raising children with special needs, educate society, and provide therapy resources. Chinedu began hosting monthly workshops, often at churches or community halls, where parents came with their children. Some came in shame, others in fear, but they left with hope. He didn't preach. He didn't promise healing. He simply shared his journey, his pain, his mistakes, his triumphs. Samto and Kamsi were always present, playing in their corner or occasionally walking up to hug him in the middle of a talk. Those moments always moved the audience to tears. People began donating old sensory toys, therapy mats, even money. Chinedu used every naira wisely, buying second-hand resources for families, paying for one child's therapy, or fixing a leaky roof at a struggling mother's home. He became more than a father. He became a symbol. But beneath all the growth and gratitude, he remained grounded. His home was still modest. His clothes were still worn. He still woke early to cook for his sons and still bathed them with the same care. Adora became his closest friend, but they remained in that quiet space between deep admiration and unspoken affection. Some nights, they sat in silence while the twins played on the mat beside them, the kerosene lamp flickering between them. "You've come far," she'd say. And he'd nod. But he never forgot the night Ifeoma left. Her absence had become part of his architecture, something he no longer mourned, but never quite forgot. He wondered sometimes if she ever thought of them, if she knew how far the burden she abandoned had come. But then he'd look at his boys, curled up against each other, safe, and remind himself, what mattered was who stayed. While Chinedu was rising from ashes, Ifeoma was crumbling beneath glitter. The man she had run off with, Benson, was a real estate investor in Lagos. Tall, flashy, arrogant. At first, it felt like heaven. Benson took her to clubs, restaurants, and hotels she had only seen on TV. He bought her an iPhone, hair from Dubai, and dresses from online boutiques. Ifeoma reinvented herself on social media. She deleted all traces of her marriage, changed her last name, and posted filtered photos with captions like "soft life only" and "no stress, just vibes." But beneath the hashtags was a woman trying to drown guilt in luxury. Sometimes at night, she heard Santo's humming in her dreams. Sometimes she remembered Kamsi's tiny fingers gripping hers. She drank wine to forget. But memories are stubborn things. They don't die. They hide, and then return when least expected. 3 years into the affair, the glitter began to fade. Benson stopped coming home on time. Then he stopped coming home at all. Rumors reached her through friends. He had a new girl, younger, lighter, hungrier. Ifeoma tried to fight, but Lagos is not for the weak-hearted. One night, Benson returned home drunk and angry. "You think you're the only woman who wants soft life," he snapped, pushing her aside. He accused her of being too old, too clingy, and damaged goods. That night, he threw her out with just a nylon bag. No money, no phone, no apology. She slept at a friend's place for 3 nights, then had to move into a one-room apartment with a cousin in Ajigunle. The walls were damp. Mosquitoes buzzed like chants of regret. For the first time in years, Ifeoma sat on a mattress and wept without wine. She cried for her marriage, for her sons, and for herself. She tried to rebuild. She started selling second-hand clothes in Balaga Market. But Lagos does not pity fallen queens. People ignored her or mocked her behind her back. She aged quickly. Her skin lost its glow. Her voice became brittle. When she got malaria, no one came to visit. She called Benson once. He blocked her. Then one day, in a moment of quiet despair, she searched Chinedu's name online. What she saw crushed her. Local father launches Autism Foundation in Enugu. She read the article 3 times. Saw his picture. Saw the twins. They were big now. Taye. Handsome. She read about Samto's speech, Kamsi's therapy progress, and Adaora's name listed as co-founder. She stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The man she had left for being too soft had become a warrior, and the children she called a burden had become a testimony. That night, Ifeoma packed her bags. She didn't know what she would say. She just knew she had to go back. It didn't take long for the news to spread. One of the women at Holy Mercy Parish spotted Ifeoma at a small restaurant near Abakpa Junction, wearing slippers and a worn wrapper. She couldn't believe her eyes. She called another neighbor, who confirmed it. Not true. Oh. Now that same Ifeoma way run leave her husband in Peking. Soon, the compound where Chinedu lived began to buzz with whispers. Women came to buy tomatoes from the nearby stall and stayed longer, hoping to catch a glimpse. A few even approached Adora at the center and asked slyly, "How far with Chinedu's ex-wife? She'd come back?" Adora didn't answer. She simply continued organizing a therapy schedule for a new child. But inside, she felt a knot twist in her chest. Not jealousy, just the return of a ghost she thought was gone. Chinedu heard the gossip too. A mechanic friend called him one evening and said, "Guy, you sabi say your ex day a nugu again? She day ask of you." Chinedu said nothing. He felt a coldness spread in his chest. That night, he walked to the backyard after putting the boys to bed and sat in silence for over an hour. He remembered Ifeoma's eyes the night she left. Not angry, not even sad, just empty. And now she was back, broken, asking questions. He didn't know how to feel. He didn't hate her, but he didn't trust her either. Could he allow that kind of pain near his boys again? Would they even recognize her? Would they care? These questions haunted him for days. He didn't tell Adora. He wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. Then, one Saturday morning, he saw her. She stood across the road from the foundation building, dressed in a simple gown and headscarf. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes were unmistakable. When their eyes met, she didn't smile. She dropped her gaze and slowly crossed the street. Chinedu didn't move. Samto and Kamsi were playing nearby, oblivious. Ifeoma stopped 3 feet away and whispered, "I didn't come to cause trouble. I just wanted to see them." Her voice cracked. Chinedu swallowed hard. The words refused to come. She looked at the twins and choked a sob. "They've grown," she whispered. And then her knees buckled. She dropped to the ground, covering her face. The woman who once ran off in pride was now kneeling in the dust, crying like a child. Chinedu turned away, not because he was angry, but because tears were already filling his own eyes, and he didn't want her to see. The community event at the foundation was a celebration of progress, a gathering of families, therapists, neighbors, and volunteers who had supported voices of the quiet ones from its humble beginnings. The venue, a rented church hall in Enugu, was modest, but glowing with decorations made by the children themselves, hand-printed cards, cut-out paper stars, and ribbons. Chinedu had spent all week planning it alongside Adora, who managed logistics, while he coached some of the children on a short presentation. Samto and Kamsi were set to perform a rhythmic handclap routine with visual cues, something Chinedu was proud of not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. As the hall filled with guests, there was laughter, music, and the warm aroma of fried rice and puff-puff in the air. But outside the hall, standing beneath a dusty mango tree with her hands shaking, was Ifeoma. She had been watching the crowd arrive, scanning for a familiar face, especially the 2 small ones she used to bathe, feed, and then abandon. Her legs trembled beneath her as the emotions she had buried returned in waves: shame, longing, fear. She hadn't planned to come in. She only wanted a glimpse. But as the twins emerged from the building in their matching foundation t-shirts and walked hand in hand to the stage, her breath caught in her throat. They were so tall now. Samto had her cheekbones. Kamsi had Chinedu's eyes. They looked happy, confident, like they belonged in this new world, a world she was no longer a part of. Her heart pounded. Her legs moved forward before she could stop them. She pushed through the crowd slowly, her eyes locked on the boys as if seeing ghosts. Then Kamsi looked up. For a second, their eyes met. Nothing. Not a flicker of recognition. He turned away. Chinedu saw her just as the applause erupted. Ifeoma stood frozen at the edge of the hall, hugging her wrapper tightly, as though it was the only thing keeping her together. Their eyes met, and in that instant 100 emotions collided. Rage, sorrow, disbelief, and grief. She took a trembling step forward. But the boys ran past her, straight into Adora's arms. Kamsi squealed. Santo tugged Adora's wrist and pointed at the snacks table. Ifeoma watched in silence, her mouth slightly open. Her sons had run to another woman. She had been erased. She turned, stumbled out of the hall, and vomited behind the water tank. Her body shook with sobs. She thought she was prepared, but nothing could have braced her for that moment. The moment she realized her children didn't even know her name. The knock came late at night, long after Chinedu had put the boys to sleep and cleaned up after the event. He opened the door cautiously, already knowing who it would be. Ifeoma stood there barefoot, with swollen eyes and tear-streaked cheeks. She didn't speak at first. She simply looked at him as though asking for permission to breathe. Then she dropped to her knees and whispered, "I'm sorry, Chinedu. I'm so sorry. I don't want anything. I had to see them." Chinedu didn't move. His arms hung limp by his sides. His jaw clenched, but no words came. This was the woman who had once said their children were a curse. The woman who vanished on a rainy night without so much as a backward glance. And now she knelt at his feet, broken. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she continued, her voice trembling. "But not a day has passed that I haven't remembered them. I've lived in shame, hunger, regret. I saw the videos. I saw Santo counting. I saw Kamsi smile. I missed everything. I gave up my soul chasing a life that spat me out like trash. And now, I just want a chance to say sorry. To them. To you." Her head bowed low, touching the concrete. Chinedu's breath became shallow. His heart pounded in his ears. He remembered the nights he'd held his sons as they rocked and cried, the mornings he went without food, the taunts, the pity, the emptiness. He remembered begging Ifeoma not to leave, how she spat the words burden and cursed like venom. Part of him wanted to yell, to scream at her, to pour out the years of pain he had swallowed. But he couldn't, because standing in front of him wasn't the proud Ifeoma who once wore perfume and wigs. This was a broken woman, empty, aged, ashamed. He walked past her and sat on the cement step. "Do you know," he began slowly, "that Kamsi used to scream at night for hours, just calling for you in sounds he couldn't shape into words?" Ifeoma sobbed harder, her body heaving. "Do you know how many times I had to pretend your perfume was still on the pillow, just to calm him down? I told him you traveled. I lied to my sons, Ifeoma, for years." His voice cracked. "I hated you. God help me, I hated you so much. But I still fed them. I still prayed for you. I still hoped, somehow, you'd come back changed." He turned to her. "Are you changed, Ifeoma? Or are you just desperate?" She shook her head. "I have nothing left to pretend with. I don't even know how to be a mother anymore. But if you let me sweep the compound or wash their clothes, I'll do it. I just want to try." Silence stretched. Then Chinedu whispered, "It's not me you need forgiveness from. It's them." The next morning, Ifeoma sat on the edge of the compound wall, nervous, dressed in a faded gown and slippers Chinedu had given her. Her palms were sweaty. Her stomach churned. For the first time since giving birth, she was going to face her sons, not as a mother, but as a stranger. Chinedu had told them gently, "Someone's coming to see you. She used to know you when you were small." They didn't respond, just rocked in rhythm like they always did when something unfamiliar was near. When Ifeoma stepped into the room, Santo looked up first. He studied her face, his expression blank. Kamsi didn't look at all, his attention fixed on his spinning toy. Ifeoma stood there awkwardly, her voice caught in her throat. Then she crouched to their level. "Hi," she whispered. Her voice broke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Santo blinked. Then, slowly, he picked up a crayon and handed it to her. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't recognition. It was something. Kamsi glanced at her, then back at his toy. She didn't force anything. She just sat beside them. For 10 minutes, no one spoke. No tears. No shouting. Just quiet breathing and soft movements. Eventually, Chinita walked in and asked the twins gently, "Do you want her to stay a little?" Samto looked at her again and shrugged. Kamsi picked up a second toy and placed it beside her. That was all the answer they gave. Ifioma burst into tears. She covered her face and sobbed, not loudly, not in drama, but in the kind of weeping that comes from years of stored regret. She didn't reach for them. She didn't hug them. She simply cried in silence, while the twins returned to their play, occasionally glancing at her, as though trying to decode the stranger in their midst. Later that day, Samto asked a question that stunned Chinidu. He pointed at Ifioma while eating and said, "She cried, why?" It was one of the few times he had formed a sentence without prompting. Chinita looked at his son for a long time, then said softly, "Because she missed you, and she's sorry." Samto stared at his plate, then nodded slowly. Kamsi didn't speak. But that night, he took one of his old drawings, a circle with stick figures, and handed it to Ifioma before bed. It didn't have meaning to anyone else, but Chinita knew what it meant. It was Kamsi's way of saying, "I see you." Forgiveness hadn't arrived. Trust hadn't been rebuilt. But something had shifted. The wall had cracked, just a little. And sometimes that was how healing began, with the smallest, quietest acts of grace. The nights were no longer as peaceful for Chinidu. Since Ifioma's return, he found himself staring at the ceiling more often, wrestling with emotions he couldn't name. During the day, he functioned like a machine, feeding the boys, organizing foundation tasks, liaising with therapists. But when silence fell, so did the memories. They came in fragments. The early days of love and laughter. The miscarriages. The night Ifioma cried in his arms when the twins were born. Then the accusations. The cold shoulders. The slammed doors. And finally, that night when she vanished, leaving behind only a note and a storm. He'd spent years building walls to keep that pain out. Now she was sitting on his porch each morning, washing the boys' uniforms and asking softly, "Can I help with breakfast?" Adora noticed his shift. She said nothing, but he saw it in her eyes, the flicker of unease, the quiet questions she didn't ask. And that made his guilt worse. Adora had stood with him through fire. She had been the voice of reason, the hand that lifted him from drowning. The boys adored her. In many ways, she had become a maternal figure to them, without needing the title. Yet now Ifioma, once the deserter, was here folding their clothes, making their meals, humming lullabies under her breath as though she had never left. Chinidu didn't know how to respond. One part of him admired her effort. She woke before sunrise, scrubbed the compound, and sat quietly while the boys played, never pushing herself on them. But another part of him remained guarded, resentful. He caught himself watching her sometimes, trying to read her expressions, to see if the old pride was still hiding somewhere. But all he saw was exhaustion and longing. It made everything more complicated. This wasn't the dramatic homecoming he'd imagined. This was slow, awkward, and fragile. He tried talking to Adora one evening, but she brushed him off. "Your past is yours. I have no right to question it," she said gently. But Chinidu saw the sadness in her eyes. That night, as the twins slept, he sat outside, the harmattan breeze cold against his skin. He thought about the future. Could he ever truly trust Ifioma again? Could she really stay this time? And what about Adora? Would she stay if she felt replaced? Could his heart stretch wide enough to carry both gratitude and pain, both forgiveness and memory? He didn't know. What he did know was that his sons deserved peace. They had endured enough abandonment, confusion, and instability. Whatever decision he made going forward, it wouldn't be about his pride or his fear. It would be about Samto and Kamsi. They were his compass now. Everything else was noise. Ifioma had imagined reconciliation would come faster, perhaps a sudden hug from the twins, or a moment when Chinidu would look at her with warmth instead of weariness. But reality offered no such comfort. Every day she was tested, not with words, but with silence. The twins didn't fight her, but they didn't embrace her either. Samto rarely looked her in the eye. Kamsi never touched her. They acknowledged her presence the way one acknowledges a chair or a shadow. There, but not emotionally visible. Still, she didn't give up. She washed their clothes, scrubbed the floors, cooked their favorite meals, even though they didn't thank her. She learned how to read their charts, how to mirror their calming routines, how to gently redirect them during meltdowns, without intruding. Adora quietly watched her from a distance. The two women never had a real conversation, only polite nods, short exchanges about meals or chores. There was an invisible tension, but neither of them addressed it. They both knew this wasn't about them anymore. One day, while folding laundry, Ifioma overheard Chinedu coaching Samto on numbers. The boy stammered, paused, then whispered, "Daddy, who is she?" Her heart clenched. Chinedu was silent for a moment, then said, "She's the one who had you in her belly. But she left. And now she wants to come back." Samto didn't respond. He returned to his numbers, as though that explanation was enough, or perhaps too much. That evening, Ifioma walked to the backyard and wept silently, face buried in her wrapper. She knew healing would take time, but nothing could have prepared her for the slow ache of being a stranger in her children's lives. She wanted to scream, to demand to be seen, to be forgiven. But she knew she had no right to demand anything. She had to earn every second, every glance, every scrap of trust, and that earning would be through labor, not language. Weeks passed. The community began noticing her. Some women greeted her with pity, others with cold disdain. "So you're back, En?" one church member said with a tight smile. "You left, and now the man is successful, you want to return?" Ifioma said nothing. She had no more pride left to defend herself. Instead, she focused on service. She began attending support meetings at the foundation, not as a speaker, but as a silent helper. She refilled water cups, arranged chairs, cleaned floors after the meetings. When a young mother broke down in tears over her nonverbal son, Ifioma quietly sat beside her and held her hand. "Just don't leave," she whispered. That was her penance, to become who she should have been from the start. Not the center of attention, not the wife in flowing lace, but a presence, a mother, steady, consistent, quiet. The shift came quietly, without fanfare. It started with Samto handing her a toy during playtime, not as a gift, but as an invitation to sit. Then, one morning, Kamsi allowed her to help him button his shirt, watching her with curious eyes, but not resisting. These were small gestures to others, but for Ifioma, they were victories more precious than diamonds. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, held the moment gently, and carried on. Her patience began to bear fruit. The boys didn't speak much to her, but they no longer avoided her. They let her sit beside them during therapy. Sometimes they reached for her hand when crossing the road. One night, as Harmattan winds blew cold, Samto leaned on her shoulder during evening devotion. Chinedu saw it from the corner of his eye and quietly wiped a tear. Adora, too, noticed. The frost between her and Ifioma began to thaw, not into friendship, but mutual respect. They were two women orbiting the same boys, one from pain, the other from nurture. Ifioma continued to humble herself. She cleaned toilets after events. She volunteered to help organize files at the foundation. She even began learning sign language from one of the therapists so she could better connect with other nonverbal children. Slowly, the community's stance began to shift. One of the church women who once sneered at her stopped by after service and said, "We see you. Keep going." It wasn't praise, but it was acknowledgement. And for a woman who had once walked out on her family in shame, acknowledgement felt like sunlight. She no longer wore weaves or makeup. Her wrapper was always neat, her scarf always tied. Her pride had peeled away layer by layer, revealing someone more grounded, more real. Chinedu began to soften too, though silently. He still kept his distance emotionally, but he noticed the way the boys responded to her now. He watched Ifioma fix Samto's sandals with a needle and thread. He saw her stay up one night during Kamsi's fever, refusing to sleep until the boy's temperature dropped. These acts weren't performed. They were sincere. And sincerity, Chinedu realized, had become rare. One evening, he said softly, "Thank you for staying." Ifeoma didn't cry. She simply nodded. That night, she prayed, not for the restoration of her marriage, or for a return to the past. She prayed for strength to continue earning the love she had once thrown away. She prayed that one day, her sons would not just tolerate her, but call her mama again. And if that day never came, she prayed for the grace to keep loving them anyway. Life had settled into a delicate rhythm. The once shaky dynamic in the house had slowly transformed into something resembling peace. Ifeoma had, over the past months, carved out a place for herself, not as the wife she once was, but as a woman committed to making amends. The boys, now more comfortable with her presence, occasionally sought her hand when walking, or tugged her wrapper during mealtimes. But they still called only one person Mom, Adora. She had never asked for the title, never insisted on anything beyond what the boys naturally gave her. And they gave her love. Deep instinctual love. She remained their safe space. And though Ifeoma tried not to let it sting, every time she heard one of the twins call Adora Mommy, something inside her clenched and twisted. Chinedu, too, found himself at a crossroads. His feelings toward Adora had grown over the years. Steady, earned affection built on pain, patience, and shared purpose. He had never said the words, never made promises. But it was there, in the way he looked at her during meetings, in how he smiled when she corrected him gently, in the quiet ease between them. One evening, after the twins had gone to bed and Ifeoma was in the kitchen cleaning quietly, Chinedu asked Adora to step outside. Under the same mango tree where they once sat years ago in silence, he took her hand and said, "I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I want you beside me through it." Adora blinked slowly, her breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You have so much history here." Chinedu looked back toward the house. "History doesn't always mean future. You were the one who stayed." When the proposal became public in the foundation, it was met with overwhelming joy. The children clapped, volunteers danced, and even a local journalist wrote a small feature on the autism dad who found love again. Ifeoma congratulated them quietly, a smile on her face and tears in her eyes. She didn't protest. She didn't beg. She simply folded laundry that evening while the twins played in the background. Later that night, she took her journal and wrote a single sentence. "Love is not a reward, it's a gift, and I had my chance." Chinedu noticed the shift in her, not bitterness, but acceptance. He respected her more for it. That night, as he sat with Adora and the boys, he looked at his life, a patchwork of brokenness and beauty, and realized that healing was never neat. It was jagged. And sometimes it made space for more than one kind of love. The Foundation's annual gala was held at a rented event center. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to fit families, children, and supporters from around Enugu and beyond. Balloons lined the walls, plastic chairs were arranged in neat rows, and paper stars made by the children hung from the ceiling like silent blessings. Chinedu wore a clean kaftan with the Foundation's logo. Adora was beside him in a soft blue dress, helping to usher in guests. Ifeoma had volunteered to serve food in the back. No spotlight, no name tags. She didn't mind. She had found her place, even if it was behind the curtain. The twins were the highlight of the evening. They stood side by side, holding microphones, dressed in matching white and green outfits. Samto began with a small speech, memorized, rehearsed, but heartfelt. "This foundation helped me talk. My daddy helped me walk. My mommy helped me feel safe." He looked at Adora, then paused. Kamsi took over. "I have two mommies. One helps me read. One gave birth to me." The hall went silent. Ifeoma froze, plate in hand. Her heart stopped. "One day," Kamsi continued, "my mommy cried. A lot. Then she stayed. She never left again." Slowly, he turned toward the back of the hall, where Ifeoma stood, frozen in place. "She is brave too." The entire room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. Ifeoma dropped the plate, her hand trembling. Her feet moved on their own. She walked slowly toward the stage, unsure if this was allowed, unsure if she even deserved it. But the twins reached out their hands, one to Adora, one to Ifoma. And just like that, in front of a crowd that had once gossiped, judged, and watched from a distance, they stood, a family, wounded but whole. As they hugged, tears streamed down Chinidu's face. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't care who saw. For so long, he had walked through life carrying scars few understood. But in that moment, watching his sons embrace two women, one who raised them with blood, one who raised them with heart, he saw the future. Not a perfect one, but a redeemed one. The audience clapped. Some wiped tears. Others smiled through sobs. And in the background, on a small banner that hung near the podium, were the words, "Love doesn't always look how we expect, but it always arrives where it's needed most." The camera flash captured the family in one frame: Chinidu, Adora, Ifeoma, Samto, and Kamsi. A picture of pain, a portrait of grace, and a final proof that even after betrayal, even after abandonment, redemption is still possible, if you're willing to fight for it. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.